rather than burrow right down into the ESG side of things, I think that it's worthwhile commenting on the macro factors and in what's happening with an incoming Labor government. And here in West Australia, the situation where we've got both a dominant Labor government in state level, and as I said, the incoming Labor government. So it's the macro settings which I think will determine how that filters through the mining sector and particularly the ESG components. And in reviewing and reflecting on that, we are at a very pivotal period as far as Australia's future is concerned, particularly with regards to the economy and the challenges which we currently face. And I will just perhaps rehash a couple of those macro factors for those that aren't too sure, but I mean, you're getting a lot of press about them. And one of the headline numbers, of course, is inflation. Now, the latest figures have come out, and we're running at about 6.1% inflation rate. And the projections are that we will peak at about an 8.3% inflation rate. Now, of course, we haven't experienced that for more than 30 years. So this is going to be very, very challenging. The Reserve Bank was a little bit tardy in responding and didn't quite get its forecast right, and so it was out by a year or two in terms of when it thought that the inflationary pressures would be such that they would need to use the large club of monetary policy to try and address that. But they're doing so, and so we've seen the rate lifted significantly over the last 6 months, and that's expected to continue to rise. And the United States, naturally enough, sets a lot of the parameters for the rest of the developed countries, including Australia. Now, the bad news overnight was that the US has slipped into a technical recession. So that's not a great lead from them. The other issues in Australia at the moment for the incoming government is that there's a lot of pressures and built up demand on wages. So there hasn't been any real wages growth over the last decade. Now, a Labor government, naturally enough, has strong allegiances to the union movement, and so the pressure on growth of wages is very significant, and a Labor government is going to have to very carefully manage that in a way that keeps their unions on side. I listened to the Treasurer last night, and what he's said is almost a hope for or wish that the unions will be gentle for a year or two, and then they will work in with the government to manage a lift in wages. Now, when you do that, the key thing that comes to mind is productivity. And there hasn't been a great national conversation around productivity for a long time. But now we're virtually forced into really having productivity front and centre. If you're going to support a growth in real wages, then you need to see a lift in productivity. And so the challenge there is, how do you achieve that? And that's where the policies from government will need to be carefully implemented, and we'll need to sort through what the practical ramifications are all the way through to industry, including mining. So if I go back to that term productivity and the implications, in order to improve productivity, there are things that we will need to do nationally which will about broadening the base of the economy. So we need to have greater diversity and we need greater complexity. Now, doing that is, of course, not simple, but the incoming government will have some policies. The outgoing government also had some significant policies. I have to be fair-minded here and let me say that I think that the coalition government was slow to respond to that challenge. So what we should have done is diversified earlier, and we've been talking about it a lot, but we haven't been acting on it. Now, the coalition government did have a manufacturing plan, a plan to invest, I think, 1.2 billion into broadening the manufacturing base. Now, that is going to be in that program is going to be in the sights of the Labor government. And one of the reasons that it will be in the sights of the Labor government is that whilst they'll be implementing their own programs, and there's nothing particularly new, they were outlined at in the election, they will be desperately seeking to trim the budget fat, because we're also faced with a massive, and I say it's a massive national debt. And Noel, this is the first time that we've talked about the word $1 trillion, but the national debt is more or less around about $1 trillion. So that is a huge number. It's a huge headline number, and it has grown enormously over the last 3 years. Obviously, a large chunk of that is as a result of the implementation by the Coalition as part of their COVID relief packages, the Job Seeker and Job Keeper programs. And let me say, again, in the interest of being fair-minded, those programs were supported by both Labor as well as implemented by the Coalition. And I think that they were very good programs, and they certainly did tremendous work in ensuring that we didn't slip into a recession during that COVID time. So very good programs, but it means that the percentage of debt has gone up from 20% approximately to 60% of GDP. So $1 trillion out of a national GDP figure of more or less $1.8 trillion. So I wanted to just spend a bit of time on some of that macro stuff, Noel. It may not interest everybody, but I think it provides the overall context for how that trickles through and impacts